Hey, everybody. I want to talk to you a little bit about settlement in New England and how that's going to be a little different than the settlement in the southern colonies. In some ways, they're similar. They are still business ventures. It's the Massachusetts Bay Colony instead of the Virginia colony, but there's still those stock things with royal charters and there are going to be some kind of important differences. Probably the first one is where the shareholders are. The Virginia company, as a business, the shareholders, the people who were trying, hopefully, to make money off of it, mostly lived in England. And so any decisions that were made by people that were a long ways away. And whereas the Massachusetts Bay Colony, those decisions were largely made by people who were local because the people who owned shares in that particular company moved to Massachusetts. All right? And what's more is when they came to Massachusetts, they found a very different land. Virginia, and I've been to Virginia, and I got to tell you, Virginia is gorgeous. It is beautiful. The earth is dark and it's wet, and you can raise just about anything there. Massachusetts is cold and it is rocky and it is cold and you can do a lot of fishing there, but it's cold. Did I mention that it was cold? It has a really short growing season, and so you can't raise tobacco, you can't raise indigo, you can't raise these things that people were raising, to make money off of. And I want you to notice something real quick. I forgot to mention is that cotton really is not a thing yet. Cotton is too hard to grow, and so that's why they were growing tobacco. So up in the north, the farms were going to be small. You had a lot of rivers, but not like these big rivers like the York River and the Mass. You had a lot of just smaller towns, and the center of town is going to be the church. Okay, and what decides, in much the same way that wealth is what decides your position in society in Virginia, your position in the church is what will decide your position in New England. All right, so what kinds of people came to New England? All right, well, we've always heard about the Puritans. So a little bit about these Puritans. Puritans were a religious group, and they were very religious. You can kind of take them and divide them into moderates and extremists. Okay? Basically, what they believed is they were Calvinists, and they believed that under Calvinist philosophy, they believed that if God is all knowing and all powerful, then he already knows who is going to be going to heaven. And so he has already predestined that to happen. And if you are predestined to go to heaven, then there's not much you can do not to go to heaven. And if you are not one of the predestined ones, and they all believe they were, then there's really not much you can do to get to heaven. So there's really no reason to go out and preaching to people. There's no reason to try to convert people because either they are saved or they're not saved. And they believed that the Church of England, they wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to get rid of anything that resembled Roman Catholic Church. All right, they were very anti-Catholic. And for example, in the English Church, before it broke off from the Roman Catholic Church, all right, they wore the robes and they had choirs and they had cathedrals, and then afterward the Church of England has robes and they on their priests, and they have choirs and they have cathedrals, and it looks basically the same thing as the Roman Catholic Church, but without the Pope. Instead, it has the King of England as the head instead of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's an interesting story about how all that comes to be, the Protestant Reformation, that I don't really have a lot of time to get into, and it's a shame because it's interesting. But they were very Protestant, and they felt like the English church, the Anglican church, did not go far enough in separating itself from what they believed was a very evil and corrupt Roman Catholic Church. And like I said, they have the the kind of the moderates, the ones who they held on to this belief, all right? And then you had your extremists. Well, the moderates stayed in England, started a revolution, and beheaded King Charles I. That's what the moderates do, is they start a revolution and behead the king. All right, and they go into a 10-year period with no king. They put a guy in charge by the name of Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector. And they endow in him all power of authority, legislative, judicial, executive. He is literally judge, jury, and executioner for the entire country. And they even write a book about it called The Leviathan. And we'll talk about that in a couple of days. But basically, the Leviathan is this idea that life is brutal and ugly and short, and the strong men rise, and we all flee to him for safety. And that was Oliver Cromwell. The extremists say that England cannot be saved. So they come to America, and they make Massachusetts. And as extremists, they would say, for example, the American Indians that were there were not among the predestined because they weren't Puritans, obviously. All right, so there was no reason really to try to convert them. And so they pushed them out, enslaved them, or killed them. And they had a lot more conflict actually in the North probably than they did in the South. For example, one of the things they did was they had a smallpox epidemic, and so they would gather the blankets from the people who had died of smallpox, or even if they had survived, and gave the blankets as a gift to the Indians. Not a very good gift. But they also have this thing that has come down to us, that we are a chosen, and they've justified this by saying we are a chosen people. We are a predestined people for greatness. There's not much we could do to lose this blessing. All right, we are going to be a great and powerful people, just like the Jews in the Old Testament, and that God will smile upon us so long as we have faith. If we have faith and we keep his commandments, then God will prosper us in the land in which we are traveling. And he will give us that land so long as we are faithful and as long as we keep his word. Now, fast forward to 2019. Where you drive around the Lamesa and you see Bible verses. You see a Bible verse, one that comes up a lot is 2 Corinthians 7:14, where it says, if my people will turn back to me and be my people, then I will prosper them in the land. And that's a very bad paraphrase, by the way. And this idea that in order for the United States to be a powerful country, or to be even a prosperous country, we must be a righteous country, and we must be a righteous people. But the flip side of that, there's American exceptionalism that says that what we do, because we're America, we're the chosen people, this is a chosen land above all others and things like this, that we have a lot more latitude of what is moral or not moral. That idea of American exceptionalism, this idea of we must be a righteous people, goes back to those Puritan ideas, those ideas that were held by those Puritans when they brought over on the Mayflower and all those other ships and came over to this new place called Massachusetts. And that wasn't the only place. They also, and lest we think that they're all really bad people, they also gave us something called the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic is another important part of American psyche, is that as we are righteous and as we work hard, then God will prosper us. Sometimes it's called the gospel, prosperity gospel. That God will prosper us, that God will give us wealth, that God will bless us with health and long life, and that our crops will be prosperous and things like this. And so Puritans and people who accept the Protestant work ethic tend to be very hard-working people. because they work really hard so that God can bless them and so that people can see that they're being blessed. And so they worked really, I mean, they were out in their fields, they worked harder than, and everybody worked. It didn't matter what your job was. If you were the preacher of the Congregationalist church, they called themselves Congregationalists, I should say, you still worked. You still had a farm. Now, your farm may not be as big as somebody else's because you're expected to go and visit the sick and the orphans and the widows and all these different people like this and knock on everybody's door and ask them why they haven't come to church and write sermons and stuff like this. But you're still expected to work. Preaching is not your work. You still have a farm. You still have a hand. Excuse me. And part of that is so that the Lord can bless your crops because of your laboring in his kingdom. They saw themselves as the kingdom of God on earth today. And that religious fervor really tied them together as a community, much tighter than they were in the South. But it also meant that there was no room for dissent. When Quakers, the Society of Friends, came into the Massachusetts territory, they were given the choice of leaving immediately or being hanged. Native Americans were usually enslaved or forced out. Dissenters, people like Roger Miller, who was a dissenter, who disagreed. He agreed with like a big chunk of the Puritan belief, but there was a part of it he disagreed with, and they pushed him out under threat of death. And he goes and he starts a new colony in Rhode Island, a tiny little state now that you get like 16 miles across or something like this. I don't know. It's like, and Connecticut is founded by, some women who, they were a little too talkative. They were a little too assertive. And so they were pushed out and they formed some new colonies down there. And so that when they were so sure of their own righteousness and their own position, I guess, there was no room for dissent. And so that is also, to a certain point, also a very American characteristic. We tend to, if you have a political view, you tend to hold on to that political view, and everybody else is just wrong. And there's no room within our political views for dissent or for differences within the norm. There's not like there's a spectrum of of conservative or liberal, or you're either one or the other. And again, a lot of that kind of goes back to those early Puritans and some of the things that they believed. Both the North and the South are going to have their struggles, but for the most part are going to be prosperous, and they are going to slowly and steadily grow throughout the 1600s and the 1700s until finally things actually were pretty good in the colonies, really. But some things are going to change in the 1750s. And so we'll get to that at a different time. Otherwise, I wish you a pleasant day and you have a great day. Bye-bye.